think it's always worth remembering the internet, the essence of the internet in some ways is a combination of extreme standardization in the TCP/IP protocols, HTML and so on, and extreme decentralization. Sometimes people talk about it only as if it's decentralized. That's completely wrong. Sometimes they overemphasize the other. And the weirdness at the moment is our threat is an internet which both becomes more fragmented and balkanized between China, Russia, and everywhere else, and an internet which still has over-centralization in the big platforms, which are even stronger now than they were a month ago because of COVID-19. So for me, the really interesting collective intelligence question is how do we get an equivalent leap forward of both standardization, centralization, and decentralization, rather than seeing them as in the 20th century model as alternatives. Often they have to come together in the digital era. So this kind of audience is very familiar with, you know, what collective intelligence means in practice, things like Wikipedia, Zooniverse, citizen science, things like Waze, and I won't go through all of those. In a sense, some of the earlier generations of collective intelligence were all about aggregating people's input, and they still are, like Wikipedia. But where I think we're going in this conversation is a slightly different question, and I'm sure Alex will be picking this up too. It's really how can a whole system think more like a human brain at its best, and combine the human, the digital, any sources of data. And in the past, we've used this framework for thinking about the different elements which come together to make a system collectively intelligent, observation, models, analysis, memory, all the things you'll see listed there. For me, one of the fascinating things in the last few weeks is, for the first time in my life, I've seen governments getting this. We often struggle to get this to governments to understand this, but COVID-19 has forced them to create assemblies of exactly these things together in order to cope with the crisis. You have to have the observation, you have to have models, you have to have prediction, you have to know what worked in the past, what was learned from previous crises. You need to coordinate your hospital supplies and ventilators, And here's just a few examples. You know, what Korea has been doing with its dashboards and data and so on is an extraordinary example of pulling together multiple kinds of intelligence in real time. And that's one of the dashboard in Seoul, which has still had 0 deaths, I think still today, as a result of very smart orchestration of citizen and tracking data. Governments have had to have their models. They've had to have, the UK has got about 7 competing models to try and make sense of patterns of spread, how policies will impact. We're beginning to see lots of sort of micro collective intelligence platforms like these ones organizing care for isolated older people and turning a network of neighbors, friends, family, professionals into a shared brain to provide food, support, etc. And then we've still got these kind of control rooms in governments trying to work out how to be in charge of things, but also mobilize multiple distributed networks. And so for me, the really interesting question for the Commission and Europe is what can be taken from that. Alex will probably talk a bit about this later, but the work done last year at Nesta in creating the collective intelligence toolkit, mainly with the UN, I think provides a really good framework for Europe. This hasn't really been applied either at city or national level in the EU yet, but essentially the approach is to say, what can collective intelligence do for each of these things? How you understand problems, like a pandemic, how you find quick solutions, like, you know, new kinds of mask or whatever it may be, or test. How do you decide and act, and how do you very rapidly learn and adapt? And we're beginning to see all sorts of great examples. So on the understanding problems, so Taiwan, I think, is at the moment the most impressive in combining data and collective intelligence in a very transparent approach to understanding, I think ahead of any European country. For me, though, in Europe, the really interesting question is how you might apply that and some of these other things to the Green Deal. And I think at the moment, and I've been doing a lot of work on this the last few months, the net zero goal is completely missing a collective intelligence or intelligence assembly dimension, whether in terms of tracking data on carbon emissions, organizing, learning, experimentation. And there's a glaring, a fantastic opportunity for the Commission to join the billions going into that with the sort of thinking CAPS and others have been doing. And I hope we can come back to that. The same applies to all the collective intelligence approaches to finding solutions. I like this one, which is from Africa, but it's well ahead of many things in Europe. This is the We Farm network of over 1 million farmers who essentially use a collective intelligence method to solve problems. If a farmer has a disease, and they use SMS plus a bit of AI to find the right person with the right solution. We've got nothing equivalent on decarbonisation projects across Europe's cities. And anyway, here's some easy tools we could be using. NASA has completely taken on board collective intelligence methods for innovation, open innovation, turning tasks from programming to designing spacesuits to corporate videos into open challenges which anyone can bid for. And again, no part of the European public sector is using anything remotely like the same scale as NASA in terms of collective intelligence approaches. The Commission isn't either. And yet we've got in Europe lots of companies doing this very well, like Lego, which for years has used its consumers in designing products, or Siemens using collective intelligence methods internally for allocating money to engineering ideas. So for me, the sort of key question is for Europe is how it's not just a sort of technical or theoretical question of next generation internet, but what kind of next generation internet helps us mobilize all the different kinds of intelligence, data, insights, ideas to solve problems, which could be pandemics, climate change, inequality, or aging. And the thing which, again, COVID is bringing to the fore is this idea of intelligence assemblies, that these systems work best if you connect them together, which of course was the great insight of the founders of the internet. If you can connect the observations, the models, the analysis, the memory, the creativity into loops of action and learning, you get much smarter systems, much more likely to solve problems. There's now lots of beginnings of examples of how this can work, and that we've always in the past used Google Maps as a kind of prompt to help people understand what this means, because Google Maps assembles many different elements from different startups and thousands of programmers and the public to create a really useful tool. We don't have anything quite comparable, again, in any of Europe's public services yet, but this is in some ways the paradigm I think we should be aiming for. In East Asia, we've got things like City Brains trying to do this for managing city infrastructures, transport, and so on. We've got interesting examples in health, like this one tracking bacteria, not viruses, bacteria in, I think now about 80 cities across the world, but trying to turn that into a collective intelligence system. The whole air quality movement through things like OpenAQ is just beginning to move in this direction again, linking observations, data on air to action and learning. India, I think, is probably moving faster now than anywhere else in the world, partly the team who created Aadhaar, which is the biggest public innovation of the last 20 years, well over 1 billion people, are now extending that to societal platforms for fields like education and water, but very much using this logic of intelligence assemblies. How do you combine the data, the analysis, the observation, the action into a single system?